No one in the military convoy looked at Wade Harlan for more than 2 seconds. To them, he was just a hired driver in an aging dark suit, quietly opening the door for the powerful chief executive Vivian Hawthorne. But when Lieutenant Conrad Bexley sneered, called Wade useless, and ordered him thrown out of the restricted wing, the room assumed the humiliation was over. Then Vivian went pale, gripped the arm of her chair, and whispered 4 words that silenced every officer present. Nobody understood yet what those words meant, or why a woman worth billions would defend a man in a rented suit. But the silence that followed told them something had shifted forever in that hallway. If you love stories where the overlooked man turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room, tap subscribe now so you never miss the next reversal. The convoy of black sedans rolled through the checkpoint at Fort Halden Air Command just after sunrise, tires humming over concrete still damp from the morning fog. Guard towers stood at even intervals along the perimeter fence, their silhouettes sharp against a sky the color of gunmetal, and the flag above the main gate snapped once in a gust before settling into stillness again. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a pair of transport aircraft idled on a distant runway, their engines a low, constant murmur that most people in the convoy had long since stopped noticing, the ordinary background noise of a base built for war and rescue in equal measure. Vivian Hawthorne sat in the rear seat reviewing a folder of contract terms, her mind already 3 moves ahead of the meeting she was about to walk into. Beside her, behind the wheel, Wade Harlan kept his eyes moving between the mirrors, the gate, and the tree line beyond the fence, a habit that had nothing to do with driving and everything to do with a life he no longer discussed. Vivian noticed the way his gaze never settled, the way his hands stayed loose on the wheel even in traffic, but she had learned months ago not to ask. There was a history between them that neither had spoken aloud, a debt she carried and a silence he preferred. When the car finally stopped at the security overhang, Wade stepped out first, circled the hood, and opened her door before the junior officers had even finished their salutes to the vehicle itself. To the young soldiers standing at attention, he was simply part of the car's furniture, a shape in a suit that existed to open doors and disappear. Lieutenant Conrad Bexley strode toward them with the practiced charm of a man who had never once doubted his own importance, greeting Vivian with a warm smile that vanished the instant he turned toward Wade. He told Wade flatly that hired staff were expected to remain in the visitor lot, that this corridor belonged to people who mattered. Wade answered without heat, saying only that his schedule kept him with the client until she was secured inside, and Bexley's smile curdled into something colder, the kind of expression worn by a man who has just decided who his target will be for the day. Inside the reception hall of the base, Vivian moved through the crowd of officers and contractors with the composure of someone who had built an empire out of other people's doubts. She was the chief executive of Hawthorne Aerosystems, and the deal she had come to close could either rescue her company or hand its future to the rival firm, Davenport Global Defense. Her father had died the previous winter, and in the months since, the board had circled her position like men, waiting for a wounded animal to stumble, certain that a woman in her 30s could not hold a defense contractor together. The program at stake was the Valkyrie, a long-range rescue aircraft designed to pull down pilots and stranded civilians out of disaster zones and hostile territory alike. And if the demonstration failed today, so would everything she had spent a year rebuilding. Vivian had spent the drive rehearsing 3 different versions of her opening remarks, discarding each one the moment it sounded too much like pleading. Because pleading was the one thing the board back home would never forgive if word of it ever reached them. She had inherited a company built on her father's reputation and precious little patience from anyone waiting to see her fail, and every meeting since his death had felt like walking across a floor that might not hold her weight. The Valkyrie program was not simply a contract to her. It was proof, both to the board and to herself, that the company could survive without the man whose name was still stenciled above the front doors of its headquarters. Wade trailed a few steps behind her, exactly where a driver was supposed to stand, saying nothing and drawing no attention to himself. Yet more than once, Vivienne caught herself glancing back at him the way a person checks that a door is locked, an old reflex she could not quite explain even to herself. Years earlier, during a humanitarian trip her father had insisted on taking into a contested border region, the convoy she rode in had been ambushed, and the man who pulled her from a burning vehicle had not been one of the family's paid guards. He had been a young soldier with quiet eyes and steady hands, a man who vanished into the smoke before she could learn his name, and she had carried the memory of those eyes for years without ever finding a face to match them. The mission had been sealed under classification so tight that even asking about it risked consequences, and Wade, for reasons of his own, had never once tried to reopen that door. There were nights, still, when Vivienne found herself replaying the sound of that convoy in flames, the particular smell of scorched metal and diesel that no perfume or memory could ever fully wash away. She had told herself for years that the soldier who carried her out that night belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed, a chapter closed the moment her feet touched safe ground. Yet some part of her had never quite believed that closure was real. As the delegation moved toward the secure wing, Bexley found an excuse to block Wade at a side checkpoint, demanding to know if he could even read the insignia on a uniform. He suggested, loud enough for the surrounding staff to hear, that drivers belonged in parking structures and not anywhere near decisions that shaped the nation's defense. Wade remained still, answering only that his responsibility ended when the client was safely delivered and would resume when she was ready to leave, and the flatness of his tone seemed to irritate Bexley more than any argument could have. The lieutenant wanted submission, wanted witnesses to see a lesser man lower his eyes, and Wade's refusal to perform that role in front of an audience made the humiliation feel unfinished to him. Bexley called Wade useless in front of 2 officers and a cluster of Hawthorne staff, and the words landed with the particular cruelty of someone who knows he will face no consequence for them. Marla Voss, Vivienne's sharp-eyed legal counsel, opened her mouth to intervene, but Vivienne raised 2 fingers just slightly, a small signal asking her to wait and watch instead. Wade looked at Bexley for exactly 1 second longer than comfortable, then said quietly that a man who is certain of his own authority is often the one who forgets to check his blind spots. The remark meant nothing to most of the people standing there, but it landed on Bexley like a slap he could not identify the shape of, and his jaw tightened as though he had been mocked without understanding how. Just past Bexley's shoulder, Wade caught sight of a technician moving through a restricted corridor with a badge clipped at the wrong angle, its color mismatched to the clearance level required for that section of the building. He filed the detail away without reacting, aware that raising it now, from his position, would only give Bexley another excuse to escalate, and aware too that suspicion without proof was worth nothing in a room built entirely on rank. The moment passed unnoticed by everyone except him, a single loose thread in an otherwise ordinary morning, and Wade tucked it into the same quiet part of his mind where he had once stored 100 details that other men missed in war zones far from here. It was a discipline he had never fully unlearned, the habit of cataloging exits, mismatched details, and the small tells of people who did not belong where they stood, even years removed from any uniform. He had built an entire second life around forgetting that discipline, around bedtime stories and school pickups, and the particular quiet of a house with only one working parent in it. Yet some instincts, it seemed, simply refused to be retired. The formal briefing began in a windowless conference room lined with monitors, where Vivienne presented the Valkyrie program, to a panel that included Reginald Blackstone, the chairman overseeing the Defense Board's evaluation. She walked them through survivability data, extraction speed, and the aircraft's ability to operate in contested airspace, answering each hostile question with the precision of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this kind of ambush. Blackstone pressed her on cost overruns, on Davenport's cheaper bid, on whether a company still reeling from a leadership transition could be trusted with a contract this size, and Vivienne answered without flinching, even as her knuckles whitened around her pen. She reminded the panel that the Valkyrie had already outperformed every comparable design in independent survivability testing, that its rescue radius exceeded the nearest competitor by a significant margin, and that cost savings meant little if a cheaper aircraft failed the very people it was built to save. Blackstone listened with the flat, unreadable expression of a man who had heard 1,000 pitches before and trusted none of them until the numbers were proven in the air, and Vivienne understood that no amount of rehearsed confidence would matter until tomorrow's demonstration spoke for itself. Bexley sat near the back of the room, arms crossed, occasionally muttering that the secure wing felt contaminated by personnel who did not belong there, a remark aimed squarely at Wade standing near the door. Several officers glanced toward the driver with fresh irritation, as though his mere presence were now the reason the meeting felt tense, and nobody thought to ask why a man in a driver's suit was the one paying the closest attention to the data on the screen. Vivienne kept her composure through the barbed remark, though the grip on her pen tightened another degree. While Wade said nothing, his attention already elsewhere, fixed on the flight simulation data being projected for the panel's review. A soft electronic hum crackled faintly beneath the audio system, easy to dismiss as a faulty speaker. But Wade recognized the rhythm of it from another life, a rhythm that sometimes meant a signal was being quietly rerouted rather than simply malfunctioning. He studied the coordinates displayed on the test flight map, cross-referencing them against the terrain briefing from memory, and found a discrepancy so small that most eyes would have slid right past it. The proposed test route had been shifted just enough to route the aircraft directly through a known interference corridor, a change that could sever communication with the plane at the worst possible moment during tomorrow's live demonstration. This was not a rounding error or a careless typo. It was the kind of adjustment a person makes when they want a failure that looks accidental. Wade had seen this exact pattern before, years earlier, in a briefing room half a world away, where a single altered waypoint had nearly cost an entire extraction team their lives before anyone thought to question the source of the map itself. The memory surfaced without warning, sharp and unwelcome, and he pushed it aside the way he had trained himself to do, focusing instead on the numbers glowing on the screen in front of him rather than the ones etched permanently into his memory. Wade took one step forward, intending to flag the anomaly before the panel moved on, but Bexley cut him off before he could finish a single sentence, demanding loudly whether the driver now fancied himself qualified to teach the military how to read a map. Laughter rippled through part of the room, thin and uncomfortable, the kind that exists mostly to relieve tension rather than express real amusement. Wade lowered his hand and said nothing further, not because he had been beaten, but because he understood that in this room, at this moment, the truth would need a louder voice than his own to be heard, and he was patient enough to wait for that voice to arrive. Patience, he had learned long ago, was not weakness but the most disciplined form of strength available to a man who had already survived rooms far more dangerous than this one. He had once waited 11 hours in a collapsed stairwell for the right moment to move, silent and still while enemy voices passed within arm's reach, and compared to that, absorbing one lieutenant's contempt for a few more minutes cost him almost nothing at all. Bexley rose from his seat, pointing directly at Wade, and repeated the word useless as though testing how far he could push before someone objected. He ordered the nearest security officer to escort the driver out of the secure wing entirely, insisting that his continued presence was both a breach of protocol and an insult to everyone who had actually earned the right to sit in that room. Several members of the Hawthorne delegation lowered their eyes, unwilling to spend political capital defending a driver against a lieutenant with connections, and for a moment it seemed the humiliation would simply run its course unchallenged. The security officer nearest the door hesitated, glancing between Bexley's rank and the obvious discomfort spreading across the rest of the table, unsure whether obeying the order would earn him praise or quiet resentment from people who mattered more in the long run. Blackstone said nothing yet, watching the scene unfold with the detached curiosity of a man who often let conflicts burn themselves out before deciding which side deserved his intervention. Wade did not raise his voice or argue his case. He turned instead toward Vivienne, and the look he gave her was not a plea for rescue but a warning, the exact expression he wore in the seconds before danger arrived rather than after. Vivienne followed his eyes to the flight map still glowing on the screen, then back to his face, and something in her chest went cold with recognition, because she had seen that precise stillness once before, on a night that had defined the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who saw the threat before it revealed itself, the same steadiness she remembered from the arms that had pulled her out of a burning vehicle when she was barely more than a girl. As Bexley kept talking, listing reasons the driver needed to be removed immediately, Vivienne rose slowly from her chair, and the room quieted simply because a chief executive rarely stands during another man's tirade. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said only one word, dropped, and told him to stop, and something in her tone made even the officers who barely knew her sit up straighter. Bexley, still riding the momentum of his own authority, told her she did not need to defend a hired driver in front of people who actually mattered, and that was the moment Vivienne's composure cracked just enough to let the truth through. She placed her palm flat against the edge of the conference table, steadying herself, and said quietly but clearly enough for every microphone in the room to catch it, that Bexley did not understand, because that man had once saved her life. The words landed like a dropped weight. Bexley's mouth opened and then closed again with nothing behind it. Reginald Blackstone's eyebrows drew together as he looked from Vivienne to Wade and back, recalculating everything he thought he understood about the man standing quietly by the door. Marla Voss stared at Wade as though seeing him clearly for the first time since the delegation had arrived that morning, and in some ways she was. Blackstone demanded an explanation, and for a long moment nobody offered one, because Wade himself had no intention of volunteering anything about a past he had spent years trying to leave buried. He said flatly that whatever history existed between himself and the chief executive had nothing to do with the contract on the table, and that the panel's time would be better spent examining the flight data he had tried to flag minutes earlier. Bexley seized the opening, insisting that a driver had no authority to interfere with classified test parameters, regardless of whatever personal story was being invoked to protect him. And his objection, loud and defensive, only deepened the suspicion now settling over the room. Marla Voss watched him carefully as he spoke, noting the way his voice climbed half an octave higher than it needed to, the telltale rhythm of a man defending territory rather than principle, and she made a mental note to pull his access records the moment the meeting allowed her to step away. It was at that moment that Admiral Warren Kingsley, retired but still carrying the bearing of a man used to being obeyed, arrived late to the briefing and stopped cold in the doorway. His eyes moved past Blackstone, past Bexley, and landed on Wade with an expression of disbelief that no one in the room had ever seen cross his face before. He did not address Wade as a driver. He said a name that belonged to no personnel file. Anyone in the room had clearance to read. A call sign whispered among a small circle of operators who had once relied on Wade to bring them home from places that did not officially exist on any map. Kingsley explained, carefully and in the fewest words the situation would allow, that the man standing near the door had once served in a specialized unit tasked with hostage recovery and equipment retrieval in some of the most volatile regions on Earth. Most of the details remained sealed permanently, he said, but what he could confirm was enough to change the temperature of the room entirely, because a soldier with that kind of record did not simply become irrelevant the moment he put down a uniform. Bexley, pale now but unwilling to surrender the last of his authority, argued that a distinguished past proved nothing about present competence, and that sentiment alone should not override military protocol. Kingsley regarded him with the tired patience of an older man who had spent decades watching younger officers mistake volume for authority, and told him plainly that protocol existed to protect competence, not to shield fragile egos from discovering they had misjudged someone. The words carried weight precisely because Kingsley rarely bothered wasting them, and even Bexley seemed to understand, for the first time that morning, that he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Wade, unmoved by the unraveling drama around him, simply asked for the flight data to be pulled back up on the main screen, then pointed out 3 separate irregularities without raising his voice even once. He identified a set of coordinates that had been quietly altered from the original survey, an auxiliary access credential that did not belong to any registered personnel at the base, and a proposed flight path that had been bent just enough to pass directly through a known interference zone. A junior technician, sweating slightly, pulled the raw logs and confirmed each point within minutes, and the room that had spent the last hour dismissing, Wade now watched him with the particular silence reserved for people who have just been proven catastrophically wrong. One by one, the officers who had laughed at Bexley's earlier joke found somewhere else to direct their eyes, suddenly very interested in the folders in front of them, while the technician who had confirmed the anomalies kept glancing at Wade as though trying to reconcile the quiet man by the door with the precision of what he had just witnessed. The base moved swiftly into a state of quiet crisis once the sabotage was confirmed, because if the corrupted data had gone unnoticed until the live test the following day, the aircraft could have lost contact in the interference corridor with no warning at all. A failed demonstration would not simply delay the contract. It would hand Davenport Global Defense the opening they needed to claim Hawthorne's technology was unreliable under pressure. Vivian understood immediately that this was not clumsy error but a deliberate strike aimed at her company's credibility, timed precisely to land in front of the one panel whose opinion mattered most. She thought of the board members waiting back at headquarters, already sharpening their arguments for why leadership needed to change hands, and understood with a cold clarity that a failed test tomorrow would hand them every justification they needed. There was no room left for pride in this moment, only the narrow, urgent task of making sure the sabotage was fully contained before it could do any further damage to a program she had spent a year defending. Wade requested that all temporary access credentials be frozen, that hallway security footage be pulled from the last 48 hours, and that the control room remain untouched until the tampering could be traced to its source. Bexley bristled at the idea of a civilian driver directing base security procedures, but Blackstone, newly humbled and unwilling to risk another public embarrassment, ordered his staff to follow Wade's instructions without further debate. Wade moved through the corridor with the same unhurried economy of motion Kingsley remembered from years earlier, tracing the anomaly back to a small transmitting device wired discreetly beneath the simulation control panel. He worked methodically, checking wire routes and connection points with the unhurried, precision of a man who had disarmed far more dangerous devices under far worse conditions, while the technicians around him watched in a mixture of fascination and quiet embarrassment at how quickly he had located what their own diagnostics had missed entirely. The device was not designed to cause an explosion or any dramatic failure that would draw immediate suspicion. It was built to feed subtly false telemetry into the system, nudging coordinates and flight paths just far enough to manufacture a failure that would look like an internal flaw in Hawthorne's own technology. It was the kind of sabotage engineered by someone who understood that public humiliation, not violence, was the more effective weapon against a company already fighting to prove its stability. Marla Voss, working quickly through the access logs, discovered that the temporary credential granted to the mismatched technician Wade had noticed earlier that morning had been authorized under Bexley's own signature. Bexley insisted immediately that his signature had been forged, that anyone could have accessed his credentials, and that he was being framed by people desperate to distract from their own company's vulnerabilities. Wade did not accuse him of masterminding the sabotage outright, recognizing that the lieutenant's arrogance made him a convenient tool far more easily than it made him an architect, but it was clear Bexley had accepted some benefit in exchange for granting that outside access without asking too many questions. Vivian confronted him directly in the corridor outside the control room, her voice steady now instead of shaken, asking him plainly how much of his own honor he had been willing to trade just to prove that a woman had no business running a defense contractor. Bexley had no answer that did not sound small the moment it left his mouth, and for the first time since the delegation had arrived at Fort Halden, he found himself unable to meet another person's eyes. Whatever certainty had carried him through the morning had drained out of him entirely, leaving behind only the hollow realization that his contempt had nearly cost far more than a single woman's pride. While technicians worked to restore the corrupted systems, Vivian and Wade found a quiet stretch of hallway away from the chaos, and for the first time all day, neither of them was performing a role for an audience. She asked him why he had never told her, in all the months he had driven her through 100 ordinary days, that he was the same man who pulled her from that burning vehicle so many years earlier. Wade told her he had not left the service to disappear from her specifically. He had left because after enough missions in enough places that did not appear on any map, all he wanted was to raise his daughter without wondering each morning whether he would come home to her. He said driving offered something the military never could, a kind of stillness, steady work that let him be present for a child who needed her father more than the world needed another quiet operator. Vivian remembered fragments of that night with unusual clarity now. The smoke, the noise, her father's blood on the seat beside her, and the arms of a young soldier who had not waited to be thanked before vanishing into the chaos to help someone else. Wade told her plainly that he did not need her gratitude and never had, that what mattered to him now was simply making sure people like Bexley did not mistake pride for the right to humiliate anyone who could not immediately defend themselves. Vivian understood, standing there in the quiet hallway, that Wade had never wanted recognition, and that understanding only deepened the respect she already carried for him without fully realizing its shape until this moment. She told him she did not know how to repay a debt like that, and Wade answered simply that she already had, every time she chose to protect the people around her instead of the version of power that men like Bexley worshipped. Neither of them said anything more dramatic than that, because neither of them needed to, and the silence between them felt less like an ending and more like something finally being allowed to exist in the open. Down the hallway, the muffled sound of technicians restoring the last of the corrupted systems drifted toward them, a reminder that the crisis was not fully behind them yet, but for this one suspended moment neither felt any urgency to move. For a moment, Vivian allowed herself to simply look at him, not as a driver, not as a ghost from a night she rarely let herself remember, but as a man who had quietly reorganized his entire life around protecting the people who mattered to him, first his daughter, and now, apparently, her as well. Wade held her gaze for a beat longer than either of them expected, then glanced at his watch, the ordinary gesture of a man who still had a schedule to keep despite everything that had happened that day. By the time the corrupted systems were fully restored, a new problem had surfaced, because the flight team no longer trusted the primary navigation algorithm enough to run tomorrow's live test without a manual verification of the backup route. Bexley had been detained pending an internal investigation and stripped of any further authority over the demonstration, leaving a gap that needed to be filled by someone capable of reading terrain, wind patterns, and emergency landing options under intense time pressure. Blackstone asked bluntly who among them could be trusted to verify a route this complex on such short notice, and Kingsley, without hesitation, turned his gaze toward Wade. Wade initially refused, reminding them that he had not worn a uniform in years and had no official standing to touch military flight planning. Vivian stepped in before Blackstone could argue the point, telling the room plainly that she did not need a soldier for this task. She needed the man who had once seen danger before anyone else in the room could recognize it, because that instinct did not expire simply because a person changed jobs. Wade studied her for a long moment, then accepted the terrain maps without another word, understanding that this was no longer only about a contract, but about proving that competence did not need a title to be real. He spread the maps across the table, tracing wind corridors, marking known interference zones, and identifying 3 alternate landing points in case the primary route encountered further trouble. He proposed a revised path that avoided the compromised corridor entirely while still meeting every performance benchmark the demonstration required, and in doing so, quietly proved that the Valkyrie's design could adapt even when its own systems had been deliberately undermined. The technical team, still shaken from the morning's sabotage, followed his instructions with a mixture of relief and something close to awe, grateful to finally have someone in the room who seemed entirely unbothered by pressure. The live test the following morning unfolded with a tension thick enough to feel in the walls of the control room, every technician holding their breath as the aircraft climbed toward the exact stretch of sky Wade had warned them about the day before. For nearly 10 seconds, the signal dropped exactly where he predicted it would, and the silence in the room stretched painfully long as monitors flickered and displays lost their steady green readouts. Wade, calm in a way that seemed almost inhuman to the people watching him, instructed the operator to switch to the secondary channel he had prepared as a contingency, and within moments the signal re-established itself cleanly, the aircraft continuing its route as though nothing had happened at all. Once the signal steadied, the aircraft descended into its simulated rescue zone, extending its recovery cable and lifting a mock casualty from the mock wreckage below, with a precision that drew a rare murmur of approval, even from the officers who had spent the previous day doubting Hawthorne's technology outright. Wade watched the readouts without expression, though anyone standing close enough might have noticed the faint release of tension in his shoulders the moment the aircraft cleared the interference corridor entirely. The Valkyrie completed its full demonstration without further incident, executing its rescue simulation exactly as designed despite having survived what amounted to a deliberate attempt at sabotage only a day earlier. The control room broke into a wave of quiet, exhausted relief. The kind that comes after fear has finally released its grip on a group of people who had spent hours bracing for the worst. Blackstone announced to the room that Hawthorne Aerosystems had not only preserved its contract, but had inadvertently proven something more valuable than any original specification. that its aircraft could withstand active interference and still complete its mission. Vivian looked at Wade across the room, and there was no need for a lengthy speech or an emotional outpouring of gratitude between them. A single nod passed between the two of them, quiet and complete, carrying more weight than any formal thanks could have managed in front of an audience still recovering from the tension of the last 2 days. It was the kind of acknowledgement that did not require witnesses to be real, and both of them understood exactly what it meant, without needing to translate it into words for anyone else in the room. Around them, technicians began packing away monitors and cables, their voices low with the particular exhaustion that follows a crisis narrowly avoided, while outside the sealed windows the sky had shifted from morning gray to a hard, bright afternoon blue that neither of them had noticed arriving. Bexley was escorted out of the facility not with handcuffs or public spectacle, but with the quieter, more permanent collapse of a reputation that had once relied entirely on rank to command respect. The internal investigation confirmed that he had accepted a private arrangement from a contractor with ties to Davenport Global Defense, believing at first that he was simply making life difficult for a chief executive he considered unfit to hold her position. He had not fully grasped that his arrogance had nearly sabotaged a program with implications far beyond one company's pride, and the weight of that realization seemed to hollow him out more than any formal punishment could have. In the days that followed, word of his removal spread quietly through the base, and few of the officers who had once laughed at his jokes found much sympathy left for a man who had traded his integrity for a grudge against a woman he had barely bothered to understand. Reginald Blackstone, to his credit, apologized to Wade directly in front of the same panel that had dismissed him only a day earlier, a gesture that cost him visibly but one he clearly felt was owed. It was a rare and expensive moment, a man of real institutional power publicly admitting that he had misjudged someone based on nothing more than the cut of his suit and the title on his badge. Wade did not gloat or extend the moment longer than necessary. He simply told Blackstone that next time, it might be worth examining the person before examining the title stitched above their pocket, and the words landed with quiet finality rather than triumph. Vivian made it clear, in terms the board could not later dispute, that she would not tolerate the kind of casual disrespect Wade had endured from anyone associated with Hawthorne's future partnerships. She insisted that any personnel accompanying her, regardless of their official role or title, would be treated with the same baseline respect afforded to generals and executives alike, and that this condition was not negotiable if the military wanted continued cooperation from her company. Blackstone, still visibly humbled by the events of the previous day, did not attempt to argue the point, understanding that whatever leverage he might once have held in that conversation had evaporated the moment his own panel had so publicly misjudged the man now standing quietly near the door. Blackstone agreed without argument, and the revised contract that followed carried new provisions for oversight and security that satisfied both sides far more thoroughly than the original draft ever could have. Marla Voss spent the better part of the afternoon redrafting clauses alongside base counsel, ensuring that the language protecting Hawthorne personnel could never again be dismissed as a courtesy rather than a requirement. By evening, both sides had signed, and for the first time in months, Vivian allowed herself to feel something closer to relief than vigilance. When the delegation finally left the base later that evening, no one in the corridor looked at Wade the way they had the morning before. The same technician who had once ignored him entirely now nodded a quiet greeting as he passed, and even the guards at the outer gate seemed to hold themselves a fraction straighter, as though word of the morning's events had already traveled the length of the base twice over. Young officers straightened their posture instinctively as he passed, an old reflex resurfacing without anyone consciously deciding to perform it. and Admiral Kingsley offered him the kind of nod exchanged only between people who understand exactly what certain silences cost. Vivian reached the car ahead of him this time, opening her own door before he could reach for the handle, a small gesture that meant more than either of them said aloud in that moment. She told him, settling into the seat beside him rather than behind him, that from this point forward he was not simply her driver, but the one person inside her company she trusted without reservation. Wade did not answer right away, because his phone buzzed quietly with a call from his daughter asking when he would be home, and he told her softly that he was already on his way, the ordinary rhythm of fatherhood settling back over him like a coat he had never truly taken off. Her voice on the other end of the line was small and bright, asking whether he remembered he had promised to help with a school project due the next morning. And he assured her he had not forgotten, glancing at the dashboard clock as though recalculating the drive home the way he once calculated extraction routes. There was nothing dramatic in the exchange, no hint of the day he had just survived, only the familiar cadence of a father reassuring his daughter that he would, as always, be there. Vivian heard the exchange and felt something in her chest ease, understanding at last that this man required no throne, no medal, and no public record of what he had done, only the simple certainty of bringing the people he protected safely home. The car pulled away from Fort Halden as the sky folded into evening color over the runway, the signed contract resting quietly on the seat beside Wade's access badge, both of them equally unremarkable to look at and equally consequential in what they represented. A man once dismissed as useless within these walls had, in less than 2 days, become the reason an entire base would remember his name long after the paperwork was filed away. Somewhere behind them, Bexley sat in a small administrative office, answering questions he had no good answers for, while Kingsley walked the perimeter fence alone, thinking about how easily rank could blind a man to the value standing right beside him. Blackstone, back in his own quarters, added a private note to his files reminding himself never again to mistake a quiet uniform, or the absence of one, for a lack of consequence. And somewhere beneath the ordinary hum of the engine, Vivian allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel safe. She watched the base recede in the side mirror, the runway lights blinking on one by one against the darkening sky, and thought about how strange it was that safety had always been closer than she realized, sitting quietly behind the wheel of her own car. Whatever the board decided in the months ahead, whatever challenges still waited at the end of this road, she understood now that she would not be facing them without someone at her side who had already proven, twice in one lifetime, exactly how far he would go to bring her home.